Hi folks, this is David Birchall and this is the second of two lecture pods for week 5 of Australian Politics and Active Citizenship for spring 2020. This week's topic is on Australia's political parties. In the first lecture pod, I talked about the history of the party system and to what extent you can actually call it a system. In this second pod, I want to focus on the actual political parties that have dominated Australian political life since World War II, and minor parties, and offer a few thoughts about the future. It's the same images you saw for lecture pod 1. Top right hand corner, there's Ben Chifley speaking somewhere in regional New South Wales in the late 1940s. He was one of the Labor Party's more successful prime ministers. These are all Labor people actually. Middle right there is Bob Hawke. Subsequent research tells me that that's in Bondi in Sydney, as it's announced that he's and Labor won the 1983 election, and poor Julia Gillard having to kiss yet another baby back in the 2010s. We often talk about politics as being involving a kind of spectrum. Often the spectrum is described as heading from left to right. People who are familiar with this understand exactly what it means. If you're not, it can be confusing. It's an abstraction from reality, of course. Individuals and groups and even parties have clusters of views about particular policies or principles or ideas, and they don't always hang together neatly. It isn't obvious, for instance, why certain environmental policies should be left-wing or right-wing. It wasn't obvious when it first became a big thing that climate change should be placed somewhere on a spectrum, though pretty quickly it was, I think. Political parties, historically speaking, I think have served to give some solidity to this idea of a spectrum, because we're in the habit of thinking of parties as belonging to the left or the right of the spectrum, and even to borrow another metaphor of a kind of a graph line, as it were, to sort of plot the parties on a graph line going further from left to right. The first political parties that I'm aware of emerged in Britain in the early 1800s, the early 18th century, the early 1700s. The Whigs and the Tories gradually shaped themselves in this way, and I think you could say they're the first example of political parties following the logic of a sort of spectrum. The Whigs were understood as being, as it were, the Progressive Party, if you want to put it that way, and the Tories as the Conservative Party, and over time this solidified and they changed their name. So the Whigs became the Liberals, where liberalism in the 19th century was thought of as the progressive side of politics, and the Tories renamed themselves the Conservatives, placing themselves clearly on the right side of politics. In terms of the words left and right, however, we need to look to France in the period of the French Revolution in the late 1700s, which is where those two images come from on the right-hand side of the screen. In the National Assembly, I believe it was, in the course of the French Revolution, the deputies elected to the Representative National Assembly, and that's not the National Assembly on the right there, that's an earlier phase of the French Revolution. But in the National Assembly, the more radical deputies sat on the left of the chamber, and the less radical ones sat on the right. I say less radical because in the National Assembly at that time, they were all revolutionaries, just of different colours. It was a matter of how revolutionary you were, as it were, that dictated whether you sat further to the left or further to the right. And so that quite physical layout, a choice of seating position to indicate where you stood in the sort of spectrum, as it were, of the National Assembly, created the metaphor of left and right that we've used, in fact, across the world ever since. In the early 20th century, with the rise of socialist and social democratic parties across the world, the left became associated with socialism, and so, if you like, the hard left or the far left became sort of socialism of the Bolshevik Russian variety, and the sort of centre-left became social democracy, which was a less radical version of the same thing, I suppose you could say. And the right often defined itself against this. Conservative parties quite often defined themselves as being anti-socialist or anti-communist, and often pulled into that the social democratic parties of the centre-left as well. The tradition of the French Revolution was important often in other countries as well. After the French Revolution, French political attitudes hardened and coalesced over the succeeding couple of centuries. It's still true today in France, pretty much, where the right was associated with a sympathy for the monarchy, when there was still a monarchy in France, supportive of the state Catholic Church in France, and the idea of national traditions, national homogeneity, the nation. And the left, from the period from the French Revolution onwards, defined itself as being republican and anti-monarchist, anti the established church very often, and also as supporters of national minorities and cultural minorities, such as, for instance, in the early 20th century, France's Jewish minority. And so the party system, first in France and then across the world, including Australia, has historically served to organise political debate and sympathies along this graph line, or this spectrum, if you like, through the mechanisms of the parties themselves. The most significant party in the history of Australian representative democracy is the Australian Labor Party, or the ALP, because it's been around ever since Federation, and in fact in different forms for about a decade before Federation as well. The Labor Party, I think is generally agreed, emerged initially out of the trade union movement, which in turn sprang up often out of the bad pay in rural work, including, for instance, the famous shearers' strike of the end of the 19th century. And yet the Labor Party, as it grew up to represent the unions, also kind of moved beyond that. And within 20 years of being formed, had formed a majority government in its own right in the years leading up to World War One, and indeed into World War One. The Labor Party modelled itself loosely on social democratic parties in other countries. It drew a special inspiration from the British Labor Party, and also borrowed some ideas from left-wing groups in the United States, and also the Democratic Party there to some extent. Nevertheless, it was less an urban and more a rural party, and less to do with factories and manufacturing than European social democratic parties. Also tended to be more pragmatic and less closely aligned to the socialist movement and also the Bolshevik movement in Russia and the Soviet Union. This has sometimes been exaggerated, arguably, but Labor also drew upon Australia's large Catholic minority at a time when culture and politics in Australia had a strongly religious division to it. The Catholic minority in the early 20th century were often drawn to Labor, Protestant majority less likely to be so, though you wouldn't want to take that too far. And these tensions between the Catholic and Protestant communities in Australia worked their way through the history of the Labor Party as well. So in the First World War, there was a bitter debate in Australia over whether or not troops should be conscripted to fight in World War One, and the Labor Party was itself split in that debate, and very often Catholic Australians not wanting to fight for Britain, seeing Britain as a foe in terms of events that were happening in Ireland at that time, generally opposed conscription, and many Protestants supported it. Nevertheless, a conscription referendum was lost, and the Labor Party was split. And likewise, after World War II, when disputes around the role of the Communist Party in Australia and obviously in the Soviet Union broke out, it was very often Catholic members of the Labor Party who were the most staunchly and strongly anti-communist, leading to a second split in the 1950s. Probably the heroic historic moment of the Labor Party was the years during and immediately after the Second World War, when two famous Labor Prime Ministers, John Curtin, that's top left, and Ben Chifley, top right, guided Australia through World War II and post-war reconstruction, and in the process also built a kind of national state and a welfare state that really hadn't existed up to that point. Also, the top left photograph is to remind us that it was John Curtin who shifted Australia's international alignment away from Britain and the imperial axis and towards the United States after the Battle of Coral Sea in 1942, when Australia was under threat and America came to our aid. But after 1949, when Labor lost power, they then spent the next 23 years in the wilderness of opposition, partly because of the splits I've mentioned earlier. When Labor re-emerged as a governing party in the 1970s and then again in the 1980s, it was modernised in different ways. Gough Whitlam and the Labor government of the early 1970s embraced new social issues that had been less interesting to older Labor Party veterans, and in the 1980s this process was taken further, and Labor's links to the trade union movement, while they were still important, were arguably less so than in the past. In recent decades, Labor has retained many of its basic convictions that you can see going all the way back to federation, the links with the trade union movements, the idea of social solidarity and the state provision of health and welfare. But it's also become more focused, I think, on values issues and perhaps less on the idea of people's economic interests. It's also in recent years had to contend with the shrinkage of some of its, as it were, traditional core constituencies. People who work with their hands are less numerous now than they used to be. Manufacturing in Australia has dwindled since the 1980s, and the workforce has shifted so that far more of us now are shift workers without proper employment contracts, or work as contractors rather than employees. That's also made Labor's life more complicated in terms of reaching out to the electorate. The Liberal Party is not as old as the Labor Party. It was formed at the end of World War II by Robert Menzies, the guy at the top right-hand corner there, who was also Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. It replaced a series of Conservative parties, most of which up to that point had defined themselves as being anti-Labor and anti-socialist parties. And by the way, that's Robert Menzies on the right with his most famous successor, Malcolm Fraser, who was Prime Minister in the latter 70s and early 1980s. The Liberal Party has been the dominant centre-right Conservative party ever since World War II. Menzies created the Liberal Party. He gave it that name. In his mind, it was based on the principles of classical liberalism, individual freedom, small government, that kind of stuff. And broadly speaking, they have been the values that the Liberal Party has continued with since. However, much of Menzies' time as Prime Minister was spent dividing the Labor opposition through clever strategies and focusing upon the threat of communism, real or imagined. At the same time, he was a less conservative Prime Minister in practice than he was in theory, and a good many features of Australian public life that were state-delivered came during the period of Menzies' Prime Ministership. Menzies' successors as Liberal Prime Ministers Malcolm Fraser, top middle there with his wife Tammy, and bottom right-hand corner there, John Howard with the current Prime Minister, of course, kept invoking Menzies' vision, although arguably they were more strongly conservative than Menzies himself had been in many respects, and they continued the Liberal Party's primary anti-Labor focus, presenting Labor as a threat to the financial and economic health of the country, which is a theme that's run through Conservative politics in Australia ever since Federation. The current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, belongs to the same party and presents himself as the heirs of Howard and also Menzies, and you can see him doing that at a party conference before the last federal election. Nevertheless, as you'll be also aware, in the current pandemic crisis, Scott Morrison himself has been surprisingly pragmatic, as Menzies was, and has invoked the same stimulatory economic policies he has condemned when Labor has conducted them in the past. Ever since 1901, there's been a constellation of small parties vying to replace one or other of the two major parties, or even just to kind of elbow in on the act and gain some of their support. So far, none of them have been especially successful. Mostly they have been successful in deposing parties from government rather than replacing them. In the 1950s, this top right-hand corner there, tensions within the Labor Party over the presence of the alleged presence of communists in the Labour Party led to a split, which was partly again on religious lines. The Roman Catholic Church was vociferously opposed to communism, and that created the Democratic Labour Party, which promptly allied itself with the Conservative parties and played a role in keeping Labour out of office for a long time, but it never showed any likelihood of forming office itself. In the 1970s and 1980s, I think in the new social climate at the time, when the Liberal Party was seen as excessively conservative on social issues such as abortion and divorce, small centrist parties sprang out of the Liberal Party, such as the Australia Party and later the Australian Democrats. Again, none of those actually breached the 10% threshold, really, or positioned themselves as potential major parties. The Greens are the most obvious recent minor party striving to be a major party, and they have said at various points that that's what they want to become a major party, and presumably the intention is to displace the Labor Party at some point in the future. And yet they've not so far managed to get far beyond that 10% limit, although, of course, one difference between the Greens and those other minor parties is the Greens are, in many respects, a youth party. An overwhelming majority of their voters are younger rather than older, which means in future they might have better prospects than minor parties in the past. Lastly, many people have commented on this in recent years. It's possible to exaggerate it, but there has been a slow but steady decline in allegiance to the major parties, or indeed to parties in general, in the Australian electorate since the 1960s. A gradual slide in the number of Australians who, when asked, say that they are, as it were, rusted on to one of the major parties, or indeed to any party, and a slow but significant increase in the number of people who say they make up their mind from election to election without any real consistency. This has also marked a generational distinction as well. Younger Australians over the last several decades progressively have become more likely to vote for minor parties, especially most recently the Greens. Lastly, there is some evidence that Australians hold to the party convictions of their families and parents far less than they used to do. It was very common for sons to follow the political allegiances of their fathers, and indeed for wives and partners to follow the political allegiances of their husbands and partners. That's far less likely to be so than used to be the case. Lastly, there is some evidence that voters think less of what they might regard as their own economic interests and more about wider values such as the environment and climate change, although it would be wrong to overstress that, since there were always values issues in the electorate. Despite all of these changes, Australia's electoral system party system, has been unusually tenacious in a world where the fortunes of political parties have often gone up and down quite crazily in recent years. We are an exception in that regard.